You're listening to episode 40 of Literacy in Color. Today's guest is the brilliant Dr. Molly Ness, educator, researcher, and one of the fiercest advocates out there for bringing books and language-rich instruction to all learners. She's a former classroom teacher turned reading researcher with a doctorate in reading education. She has background as an associate professor of 16 years, and she's the author of 6 literacy books. Dr. Ness has served on the board of directors for the International Literacy Association and helped found the Reading League New York chapter. From consulting with school districts to leading literacy nonprofits and working with major publishers, she brings deep expertise in reading development, equity, and teacher education. And she's just as passionate about helping kids fall in love with books as she is about the research that helps them learn to read. In today's episode, we're talking all about the power of Read-Alouds, especially think-alouds, and how they connect to language comprehension, literacy equity, and yes, even brain chemistry. We also dig into Dr. Ness's advocacy work around book access and what it really means to end book deserts. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Literacy in Color. Today, we have the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Molly Ness, who wears many hats. She's an educator, a researcher, a consultant, a speaker, an author, all of the things. And you may know her as the author of the book Read Aloud for All Learners. Today, we're going to be chatting about the importance of Read-Alouds, but also we're going to get into the importance of book access. And I love how Dr. Molly Ness refers to herself as a fierce advocate for equity and access. And I think that is an important conversation to have today. So first of all, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Can you take a moment just to briefly share your background in education and as it relates to this whole structured literacy world?
Sure. I started as a classroom teacher out in Oakland, California with Teach for America, teaching in a very under-resourced middle school. Then had a very different experience teaching in an independent school in Los Angeles that was very well resourced, and quickly realized that education was a social justice issue that really mattered to me, but I needed to know a heck of a lot more. So came back east. I'm an East Coaster by nature and spent 4 fantastic years at the University of Virginia, earning a doctorate in reading education. The majority of my research focus was on reading comprehension, and really felt like my value add in the world was translating research to classroom practitioners. I felt very frustrated by the sort of, typically speaking, there's a 10-year gap between what we know and in peer-reviewed research and how it makes its way down to classroom instruction. And I really wanted to sort of do what I could to bridge that gap a bit more. So I took a position as a professor at Fordham University in New York City, where I did literacy methods courses, all in structured literacy, as well as doctoral training, and left higher ed. I was there for 17 years and left higher ed just a couple of years ago. I worked at a literacy nonprofit. I worked at a big publisher, and now I'm doing a lot of work writing, obviously, and doing a lot of work around helping schools implement the science of reading. I feel like the last few years have been sort of this frenetic pace and energy around understanding what the science of reading is. And in many ways, that's the easy work. The real hard, challenging longitudinal work is around the implementation. And so I've been in districts and schools working around that.
Yeah, it's so interesting how you mentioned that 10-year gap between the research and the practice. And it's so important to have that bridging piece. And a lot of times research is just not accessible to the people who need it. So we need people like you to help bridge that application component. And I know that you're also you're host of the End Book Deserts podcast. So can you tell us a little bit about exactly what is a book desert and how that project came to be?
Sure. So when I was a professor, I was writing all of these peer-reviewed papers that I needed to do for the whole promotion and tenure process, but was very well aware that they weren't really making their way into the hands of the people that needed them. And I came across a research article by Susan Newman that looked at book access. Susan Newman is a professor at New York University. She was one of the principal authors of the No Child Left Behind, actually the Reading First legislation back in the early 2000s. And she and her colleagues went to 3 different cities and chose very different neighborhoods in different cities, high income neighborhoods versus low income neighborhoods. And what they did was they literally pounded the pavement to see if they were a child outside of school hours looking for a book to read, how likely would they be to find books? And the statistics were staggering. There was just such a disparity in book access in high income areas versus low income areas. And the figures today show that 32 million American children lack access to books in their homes, schools, and communities. And so we call these book deserts. Traditionally, we define them as under-resourced areas where books are hard to come by. I also think about overlooked populations. And by that, I mean kids living in the foster care system, children whose parents are deployed or incarcerated and may not have access to bedtime stories because their parents are away. And so in this podcast, there's about 40 or 50 episodes, I believe. I feature an innovative person or program every episode, somebody who is working to get books to the hands of children, everybody from a big organization like Dolly Parton Imagination Library to really grassroots people who are riding their bicycles over school breaks and summer vacation into areas where kids are hanging out. There are people who are doing book access work in laundromats. There are people who are doing book access work in vending machines. So all these different innovative people and programs really working to give access. Obviously, good instruction that is aligned with structured literacy is essential, but you also got to have the materials that you need to practice this instruction. And that is just the physical presence of books.
That is so powerful. And you think about how much the actual presence of a book actually matters in a child's career and what they're able to just pick up in terms of literacy, having those experiences, reading aloud at home, having text in hand and having access to that and why that's so important. Is there any particular research that shows the importance of a vast library at home and those types of things?
Yeah, there's actually global research. So my podcast just looks at the book access in the United States because I want to really make people aware that this is something literally happening in our backyard. But there's some pretty interesting research that looks at global book access and shows that, first of all, books are, even in the United States, number of books in home is used as a projection of a child's sort of academic, scholarly culture in their family. So the more books that a child has, the sort of correlates to how much parents are involved and invested in their child's education. And we know that kids who have books in home are likely to have 3 years more schooling. And that's that global research study, a 2010 study, just because of what books represent and that scholarly culture. And one of my favorite quotes from Susan Newman reminds us that when books are not available, book reading becomes an occasion and not a routine. So it's something like a birthday party that happens, once as an event, but not something that is happening all the time and with the frequency that we want it to.
Wow, that's moving. And I think about what kind of initiatives can we listening take on to help end the book deserts. And I know some are bigger than others, but even in the classroom, I'm thinking to my experiences working as a literacy coach. I was in charge of literacy night. And one of the things, every family that walked through those doors got a free book. We also had teachers sometimes sift through their classroom libraries and they have books that they no longer have room for in their classrooms. So we made boxes, free books, come shopping, take as many as you'd like to take home. All of those little things can add up and make a difference. But what other things perhaps can we do to help end these book deserts and just bring more access into the homes?
Well, I think what I love about this work is everybody can get involved in some way. So maybe you have time. Maybe you have the ability to go to some of these book donation places. And my website has a list of all of the warehouses and sort of the book programs. And you and your family sort books and go through them. And, this one looks great, or I wouldn't give this one to a kid. So you sort books with your time. Obviously, there are tons of places you can donate money. I've had kids who, for their 8th birthday or for their bar bat mitzvah, have said, in lieu of gifts, please bring a book that I will contribute to whatever organization. So it's super fun to see kids who are sort of like, wow, I can't believe that there are kids out there who don't have what I have. And this is something I can immediately do. So there's just so many ways to get involved. I've worked with Girl Scout troops who have taken that on as their service project. And frankly, the advocacy, just using your voice, is one of the most compelling things. I think we because books, for many of us who are literacy lovers, we assume that they're available. They're not something that expires. So they're not like food that is hard to get. They're not a resource that has a human being attached to them. So they're easy to distribute and readily available. So a lot of people are just completely unaware. And I say that as having been in the literacy space for decades until I was aware of that. So really just being aware of the reality and sharing it with other people. And then as teachers, I know when I was in the classroom, I was super possessive of my classroom library and my books and didn't want to part with them and didn't want to send them home. And I'm reminded of a quote by Donna Lynn Miller, who many people know as the book whisperer, the literacy advocate, who states, I'd rather lose a book than lose a reader. And so I think we can all sort of let go of our sort of initial, like, no, you can't take my cloud. What if they don't bring it back? Well, what if they don't bring it back? And what if that's the only book that kid has at their house because they got it from your classroom library? So I think we have to be willing to share the resources we do have, even if they're ones that we may not likely want to lose immediately.
Yeah, whenever we would do trainings about classroom libraries and those kinds of things, we used to tell our teachers, expect to lose about 10% of your library every year. Like that's actually a good thing. We want to send those books home. We want to make sure that students have some content at home because not all of them do, and not all of them have shelves and shelves of books like some of the teachers' children may have.
Sure.
So let's shift gears and talk a bit about Read-Alouds. In your book, Read Aloud for All Learners, you emphasize the importance of Read-Alouds. And you mentioned already, reading is a whole social justice issue. So how do you see Read-Alouds in particular playing a part in that and maybe creating more equitable classrooms and combating the effects of book deserts?
Sure. So every time we read aloud to kids, and I'm talking about kids of all ages because the research is out there, read alouds are not just the purview of our early childhood classrooms. They have benefits for people as adults. So when we think about read alouds, really what we're doing is building language comprehension and giving kids access to texts that are written above their grade level. We're exposing them to vocabulary and content knowledge and language structures that they may not have the ability to get to when they're doing the reading. So I'm just such a huge advocate for read alouds. First of all, there's this myth that the science of reading is all about word identification and lifting words off the page. And how do read alouds fit in that? Well, actually, read alouds, there are research articles that show that shared reading experiences and read alouds build some of the phonological awareness skills that our kids need for foundational skills. But we can't overlook language comprehension. And language comprehension is a huge part of the science of reading, as well as the body of research around read aloud. So when I started writing this book, I was just blown away by how impactful read alouds are. I was also kind of amazed that this actually rang true to me as a classroom teacher. I didn't really plan my read alouds. I would sort of pick a book, choose how many minutes I was going to read. Maybe, I'd circle a couple of vocabulary words, but I didn't really intentionally plan my read alouds. And that's actually what the research says, that 50 to 70% of teachers don't pre-plan or intentionally plan their read alouds. Other research shows that when we don't plan our read alouds, we miss instructional opportunities. Our teacher language is not as rich and explicit as it could be. We choose the wrong vocabulary words. What we have students do is sort of the kind of bare minimum. So to me, the big so what is most of us don't plan our read alouds. And again, I'm not, throwing shade. That was me as a classroom teacher. But when we do plan our read alouds, we can really maximize the language comprehension benefits and instructional capacity of those read alouds.
Yeah. And before you mentioned the whole science of reading craze about word recognition, and rightfully so, that's an area where a lot of teachers just were lacking or they ignored completely. And so it got a lot of attention in recent years. But at the same time, there became this idea that, we have to throw all of our books away. We only need decodables in the hands of children and every other book is bad. And even if we're not using the leveled system, honestly, there's no such thing as a bad book, and different books have different purposes. And so when we're thinking about exposing our students to language, we're not going to be using decodable text with our read alouds. That's not going to offer that rich, sophisticated language that they need to develop that language comprehension aspect. And sometimes that involves those level texts. It's just we take the level away. It's just a book. A book is just a book. We don't have to be so worried about that whole notion. Essentially, we want to just provide those rich experiences. And also, when you talked about the idea of teachers not planning their read alouds, that really rings true, I think, for a lot of teachers as well, because you think about just pulling a book on your shelf, you have 10 minutes and you're going to read a book to your class. When in reality, like you mentioned, when you don't plan for those lessons, your questions become very surface level because thinking on the spot is really tricky. And when you don't have that intentionality, you don't have time to get to the meat and potatoes, the deeper questions, the critical thinking questions, and those kinds of things that are truly going to build comprehension and not just kind of regurgitate things that were read. So I love that you mentioned that.
Yeah, and I want to just pick up on one thing that you reminded me of. One of the reasons that we read aloud to students is the richness of vocabulary. So there's some fabulous research that calls picture books lexical reservoirs, which I just love that expression because it sort of gives this image of like this richness of vocabulary. And there's some research that shows that quantified and qualified the vocabulary that exists in children's books. And I'm not just talking children's books as like the classic picture book. I'm talking early readers and, middle grade such. But not surprisingly, vocabulary that is in children's books is much richer than the vocabulary sources that kids otherwise hear in their day, which is everyday conversation, what they hear from their families, what they hear on the bus stop. And then the second main source of language input that children are exposed to is media. So TV, tablets, that sort of thing. And when you look at the vocabulary, obviously those children's books offer richer vocabulary than kids were going to hear in TV and in adult conversation. And so to me, it's just a continuous reminder. If we really want to bathe our kids in rich oral language, we cannot overlook read alouds.
Yeah, I love that. I saw a chart once outlining all the different experiences, and it was like the conversation between two college-educated adults doesn't have as much sophisticated vocabulary as a read aloud. So important. Is there any other research that you find just compelling and beautiful about read alouds that you want to share?
Yeah, so a lot of the research, and I will happily direct listeners to, I always joke that I will happily violate copyright law and share out some of this peer-reviewed research. Most of it exists behind paywalls, and I very much believe research should be free and readily available to the people who need it. The great irony I always tell people is my sister is a copyright lawyer, so she's ready to throw me in copyright prison when I share, these peer-reviewed research articles. What I love about most of the research around read alouds is it is confirmation of what many of us at our gut level already know. We know that we like doing read alouds. We know that kids like read alouds. We know that their comprehension, their vocabulary, their background knowledge all increases. So there's tons of that sort of affirms what we already know. But there's also some pretty staggering research that shows physiological benefits from listening to read alouds. There's one particular study that looks at babies in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU. So these are premature medically fragile babies. And when their mothers read to to them. Some of the reading was like whisper voice because these were really medically fragile babies. Their blood oxygen rates increased and their heart rates decreased. And that happened not just during the read aloud, but for sometimes up to 30 to 60 minutes after the read aloud. So literally by listening to the read aloud, their bodies reach like a medical homeostasis. There's other school age hospitalized children studies that showed that when children are read to, their cortisol levels, which is our stress hormone, decreases as well as their pain levels decrease. And in addition, their oxytocin, which is the like warm, fuzzy, when you hug somebody you love, when you snuggle on the couch with your dog, that like warm, fuzzy feeling, that's your oxytocin. Oxytocin increases with read aloud. So literally physiological benefits, which to me is just like completely mind blowing because we're talking about something that's free, something that anybody can do. And when I say anybody can do it, I'm mindful that read alouds for a family who is not entirely literate themselves or not comfortable with reading, they can read aloud from wordless picture books, make up stories through those wordless picture books. Families who are not native English speakers, the benefits of reading aloud to children in the child's home language are just as powerful. So it's literally something anybody can do.
That is amazing. I love hearing about those physiological benefits. And how affirming is it to talk about, this is something that we all enjoy doing, teachers and the students, and look at all of the benefits that come out of it. And I'm even thinking a lot of teachers love to do their read aloud after recess or after a hectic time because it calms the students down. Well, there's actually proof that it does do that.
That's how I started as a classroom teacher. I was a middle school teacher who all of my kids would come back from lunch and whatever you call middle school recess, totally amped up. It was crazy time. And so I would do like a 10-minute read aloud to just sort of like welcome back, get your bodies focused, get your minds ready to go. And that's what my entry was. And again, I didn't plan my read alouds, but I did see this like, okay, we've taken all of the teenage drama and angst that happened out on the blacktop or in the cafeteria, and we've put it to the side and we're ready to focus. And for many teachers, it's so validating to say like, okay, I now have the research that shows there are academic, linguistic, physiological, psychological benefits to read alouds. And here is the justification that I should be doing them. My kids need them. My kids benefit from them. And that's really empowering for people.
Yeah, definitely empowering. And so to amp up the whole read aloud experience, we can be even more intentional with our stopping points and actually planning for our read alouds with some intentionality. So what types of things do you think are important to take into consideration when we're both choosing the text that we read aloud and when we're planning for the text that we're going to be reading aloud?
Yeah, so choosing the text is obviously, there's so many factors that go into consideration. Are you choosing a text because it has a key element that you're trying to, lean into, that it uses figurative language? Or are you trying to choose a text because it correlates with a topic, a domain of knowledge you're trying to build? When I look at text selections, I'm always surprised by this relatively recent article that showed that 94% of early childhood teachers chose fiction texts as their read aloud. And that to me is this red flag that we have to be more mindful that we need to do read alouds in nonfiction and informational text, particularly as our kids are increasing in grade level, therefore increasing in the time that they spend in informational text. But if you look at what we're reading aloud, so much of the time it's not informational text, it's not nonfiction. So I bring that up because I'm always trying to encourage, can you be more reflective in what you're reading aloud? Can you do more nonfiction texts and informational texts? And the big thing for me when I'm planning my read alouds is I intentionally choose places where I want to model what I, as a proficient reader, am doing to build comprehension. I do something called a think aloud, which many of us do in different capacities. I do think alouds to build comprehension. So what I mean by think aloud is first person narrative language, where I'm modeling what I, as a proficient reader, am doing to make sense of a text. So I'm saying, I'm getting the sense that, to model an inference, or I'm saying, I'm wondering how to model that I'm generating a question about the text. And what we know about think-alouds is they are really the sort of magic silver bullet to build kids' comprehension. So much of teacher language during read-alouds we are asking kids questions. And those questions check understanding, but they don't build understanding. Just by us asking kids, what might happen next? What did the boy do? That's not actually building kids' comprehension. Well, I want to build their comprehension. And if I'm going to build it, I have to model mine through a think aloud. And once I started realizing the research around think alouds, my instruction totally changed. And so what I'll do is I'll choose those spots that are intentionally difficult, and I'll model my thinking through a think aloud. And think alouds are quick. They're not a mini lesson. They're, 1 or 2 sentences in conversational language where I'm showing what I'm doing to make meaning so that my kids not only better understand that part of the text, but they take my reading behaviors and they apply them to their own text.
I love that. And I think many teachers are familiar with the concept of think-alouds. And we have all these different types of stopping points. We've done turn and talks and give me a gesture and stop and act and all these different types of ways to interact with the text. But the think-aloud, I love how you mentioned how it just cracks your head open in showing them your thought processes as you're reading. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, how other stopping points are working towards checking for understanding, while think-alouds are really towards building that understanding. And going back to the text selection and having this huge discrepancy in fiction versus nonfiction, I know that now, as a lot of teachers want to shift towards more evidence-based instruction and taking into consideration of knowledge building, a lot of schools are shifting towards these topic-based units and hoping to build that knowledge. And of course, not all knowledge has to be nonfiction. Some is just cultural, worldly knowledge. But there is more of a shift to learning about the world and gaining insights bit by bit. So I think it's really wise to be reflective on our practices in book selection. And I think I even read some research at one point showing the statistics in how many books teachers choose that are just outdated.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Picking the classics. And of course, we love the classics, and classics are classics for a reason, but there are so many beautiful books these days, even within the last 5 and 10 years, that have been put out into the world. Going back to where we started in the beginning about equity and just looking at the sea of faces in front of you and making sure that you're choosing books that are representative of all of the children in your class. And I love that quote by Rudine Sims Bishop about how books should be windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, and choosing books that would facilitate those kinds of feelings as we read aloud too, I think is really important.
You're referencing the same article that I'm referencing, which I think is a must read for teachers, and I'm happy to share. It's written by Kristen Conradi-Smith, and I'm blanking on the name of her co-author, so my apologies to that co-author. But they had teachers write in over the last however many weeks, what were the titles that you read aloud to your kids? And they got hundreds of people to participate in thousands of titles. And 94% of those titles were fiction text. And then the other staggering statistic was that books were on average 25 years old. In no way, I want to be really clear, in no way am I saying Bad Case of Stripes and Corduroy and all those beloved texts, there's no time and place for them. But 25 years old, can we be more representative? Can we be more current? Because the world looks very different today than it did 25 years ago. And so we want to make sure we're giving our students access to that. And in my Read Aloud book, there are lots of resources for, if I'm sort of thinking about my text selection, where can I go to choose other books? Because there's a lot on teachers' plates, and not everybody is somebody who just loves going down the rabbit hole that is children's books. So there are people who that's entirely their world. So let's lead into their work and make our workload a little bit easier. I've sort of curated some of the lists and the awards and where I would go to choose my texts if that was an area that I needed to support more.
Yeah, that's definitely a good resource to have to look into, because it's difficult to find the best of the best. I've gone to entire workshops about diverse books and these are the best read alouds of this year and such. And it's really wonderful information to get. And I think even when it comes to the planning, you think about how many books you actually read aloud to your students across the year, and it might might be overwhelming to think about planning intentionally for every single one of them. And I think this is where grade level teams really should work together and harness each other in sharing the work. And maybe I plan this read aloud and then I share it with my neighbor next door, and they could take my stopping points and my think-alouds and be able to take that planning, so I'm not just reading off the cuff the next time I pick a book off my shelf.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite things to do with teachers is I'm going to sit and plan my think-alouds, put them on sticky notes, leave them in the book for this text. You're going to work on another text, and then we'll swap, and that, we're working smarter and not harder there.
Yeah, I love that. And another thing that I used to think about as I was planning my read-alouds as a literacy coach was much different than planning as a classroom teacher, because I had the time to do that and model for my teachers. But to think about the transfer of questions from one book to the next, the type of think aloud I might model in one book, can I model something similarly in another book so they see that thinking process repeated, so that when they are reading a book on their own, perhaps they can have similar experience in cracking that comprehension aspect.
Yeah, it's so intentional. I love that.
Yeah. So we talked a bit about think-alouds, what they are. Do you have any more perhaps teacher language that we can take into consideration when we're doing our think-alouds? Do you have a few more sentence starters just to give people an idea of what it might sound like?
Yeah. So I tend to do a lot of inferencing when I do think-alouds, because that is certainly a powerful strategy that kids struggle with. So for that, I do from the text, I'm getting the sense that, or I will do, the author doesn't come right out and tell me, but I'm thinking that, to model some of my inferencing. I really intentionally model comprehension breakdowns, because first of all, I want to normalize struggle. I want to show my kids that I, as a reader, struggle, but more importantly, I do with some intentionality to address that struggle. So I might do something like, I'm having a hard time understanding, or I'm confused by, to sort of model that this is a sort of the comprehension train has gone off the track. And then I'll model with that, what I'm going to do to clarify is, X, Y, Z. I also do a lot of synthesizing. Sometimes people conflate or confuse synthesizing and summarizing. I think of synthesizing as sort of this recurring, you're taking in new information and changing and evolving your thinking, whereas a summarization is sort of this stagnant, flat thing. So to model a synthesis, I might do something like, at first I thought, but now I'm thinking, to sort of say that my mind is changing. So those are some of the ones that I do. I typically stick to a handful of strategies because I want to be really intentional and not just, pepper kids with too many strategies. I want to sort of focus on, this is a great book for inferencing, so I'm going to show you all the different places that I've inferred. But the core of all of these is that first person narrative language. And lots of times people say, oh, I'm doing think-alouds, and then I'll go and watch them. I'm like, no, you did an amazing turn and talk, which serves its purpose, but is not modeling. If it does not have that first person narrative, I'm wondering, I'm getting the sense, then it's not a think aloud.
I love that. And I love the comprehension breakdown piece, especially for our students who are reading a text, and oftentimes they'll just breeze through. What did you read? I have no idea. I don't remember. So for you to model that in terms of, I'm feeling confused. Now I think what I'm going to do is go back and reread it. And just to explicitly say I'm going to go back and reread it, it's like, oh, hey, I can do that. I didn't know I could do that. So it kind of just gives students a window into the reading behaviors that we want them to do while they're reading as well. So I think that's so powerful.
When I started knowing about think-alouds, I shifted my readers' conferences, or like when I would check in with kids about what they were independently reading. Because all of my previous reading conferences, the kids would come up and they'd tell me a summary of the book or where they were, what was going on. And now, frankly, I haven't read every book. And you giving me a plot summary, it's not really showing you much as a reader. So instead, what I would have kids do is in their books, they would mark pages of where they were doing some think-alouds. They would put a sticky note literally on their page. And then they would come to a readers conference and we'd go back to that sticky note page. And I would say, tell me what you were thinking here. And so my conferences and my individual check-ins didn't become a plot summary. They became what reading behaviors were you applying to your independent reading? And it really shifted to something that was a lot more meaningful.
Yeah, and it becomes this metacognitive experience.
Absolutely.
And that's what we want students to do. We want them thinking about their thinking, not necessarily regurgitating a book that, hey, I can't tell you the summary of the book that I read last week. I already forgot it. But to build those metacognitive skills, I think is really important. And do you find your language differs significantly from kindergarten to upper elementary? And I know your book is even, up until 8th grade. Perhaps the sophistication of the content is a little bit different.
Not really, because frankly, if I think about the thinking that I'm doing in a picture book versus the thinking that I'm doing, the book I'm reading for my adult book group, I'm still doing the same stuff. I'm still making inferences. I'm still, asking questions of the text. So yes, it's at a more sophisticated level, but the strategy itself or the behavior itself is still rooted in the same core foundation.
That's really helpful. And even in terms of fiction and nonfiction. Yeah. So for the teacher who perhaps wants to be more intentional about their read aloud practices, what small piece of advice would you give them to help them refine their approach?
The number one thing I would do is I would preview the text and put sticky notes down in the pages that are sources of confusion. And there's no magic number. It's sort of a precarious balance of how many times do I stop versus, am I stopping too often? In a picture book of average length, I'll sometimes stop about 8-ish times. It may be 7, it might be 10. It's just, so there's again, no solid number. So I would encourage people to really find those places, kids' comprehension is going to go off the rails, and then model it, write down some of those think-alouds and try it out on my website, which is Dr. Molly Ness. It's DrMollyness.com. I've got lots of videos of myself thinking aloud so that you can watch me and see how it goes. Use them in your teacher study work groups and, grade level meetings and say, did you notice how she did this? I would have done that, because it is obviously super useful to see things in action. So I would encourage, if this is a totally new way of approaching a text, see how I've done it and start with that.
I love that. And I don't remember if it was you or someone else, but I remember a little tidbit too, is we can even use a gesture when we're thinking aloud. We can place our finger to our brain and just show at this point, this is when I'm modeling a think aloud, is when I'm pointing to my own head. And any other stopping point, perhaps I'm not doing that. So it's like another signal to the students. This is my think aloud.
Absolutely. Because otherwise, I will literally say to my kids, and I was actually doing this in a classroom in Queens, New York with 3-year-olds. They had literally just woken up from their nap. There's drool coming from their mouth as they're waking up. But 3-year-olds, we can do think alouds. And I would say to my kids, sometimes you're going to see my finger on the side of my head. If you see it there, those are the words that are happening in my brain. If my finger's not there, they're the words in the book. And when I was doing this with a middle schooler, the middle schooler looked at me with this light bulb moment. And I was like, yeah, what's going on? He's like, all those words that you were saying when your finger was on the side of your head, that's what I'm supposed to be doing when I'm reading. I was like, yeah, reading is thinking. Nobody had ever told him that. And just the literal concreteness of the gesture of the finger on the side of your head was like, oh, I get it now. One of my favorite articles about think-alouds is the title is called, "You Can Read This, I'll Show You How." I'll show you how is a think-aloud. I love that it's that crystal clear. I'm going to show you what to do to be successful in this text. And that's what a think-aloud is. I've also worked with teachers who have gone into Burger King and taken all of the crowns and made them into thinking caps. And literally, especially for little kids, will wear the thinking cap to demonstrate, now I'm thinking. And then you can move it to a time where you invite kids in to do the thinking themselves. The thinking cap's on your head. What are you thinking here?
Anything to make it tangible, because obviously your thoughts are something that I can't see. And when our students are thinking, that's something that we can't see. So to have something that can just make it a little bit more concrete and tangible, I think is really a powerful teaching move. I also loved the idea of Post-its, and my books would always be flooded with those Post-its, and it looks messy, but honestly, it's really, really important work. And one thing that I would do afterwards, sometimes just for the ease of organization, is I would move those Post-its into a manila folder and then file away the manila folder. And then next year, take that book out, take my manila out and stick those Post-its back in, just like a little organizational tip, but anything to just make things easier.
Yep. And I would always find that when I get to the page that I'm reading, I'm showing kids the illustrations because obviously they'll freak out if you don't. And then you pull the sticky note, you hold it in your hand. It's there as a safety blanket. You're not sort of reading it robotically, but it's there as like, oh, this is going to jog my memory of what I'm supposed to say at this time. And then I typically put the sticky note back in the book right there and then flip the page. And then it's literally ready to share with the teacher next door who did the think aloud for a different book.
Yeah, fabulous. And again, so important to plan so that our stopping points just aren't surface level so that we can build that comprehension. So Dr. Molly Ness, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I know you shared your website already. It sounds like you have some fantastic resources and videos that my listeners can tap into. Is there any other place that listeners can find you? Of course, go check out the link in the show notes for your book, Read Aloud for All Readers, for more information to refine your Read Aloud practices. But the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So if you just Google my name and send me an invite, I constantly sharing out articles. I actually just wrote a white paper on language comprehension. It's a 14-page white paper explaining what language comprehension is and how we can facilitate it in the classroom. So that's on my LinkedIn profile. And I have a new book coming out in May of 2025 that is about orthographic mapping. It's from the Scholastic Science and Reading series. And it gets at the notion that as adult readers, we have 50,000 words that we instantly recognize. How did they get there? And how can we get our students to the point that that is their reality? So I wrote it with my colleague, Katie Pace-Miles, and we'll be doing a lot of work to explain the fascinating science around brain and also how words stick in the brain.
I already pre-ordered my copy. I'm going to have you back on the show to talk about that.
Sounds great.
So thanks again for coming on, and I'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.